In the early 1600s, the first African slaves arrived on the coasts of North America, starting a painful period in the country's past. The transatlantic slave trade, which started in the late 1400s, forced about 12.5 million Africans across the ocean between 1525 and 1866, with roughly 10.7 million making it through the harsh trip alive. These people, ripped from their homes and loved ones, formed the foundation of the American economy for many years. In 1619, about 20 African slaves first reached Point Comfort, Virginia, on a Dutch ship. This small event paved the way for the widespread enslavement of Africans in the colonies. As the Ghanaian scholar and poet Abin Abuzia sadly noted, the experience of Africans in the Americas starts with a flow of tears and a path of blood. The growth of slave plantations in America came mainly from money-driven reasons. As European settlers built in the New World, they saw huge chances for farming profits. But crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar needed a lot of workers. At first, indentured servants from Europe filled this role, but as demand rose, owners turned more to African slaves. In 1705, Virginia's Assembly made a law that all slaves would serve forever, making chattel slavery official. This rule responded to the need for cheap workers and tight control over Africans. Benjamin Franklin, in a 1773 letter to Dean Woodward, pointed out the unfairness of the slave trade, saying Britain prided itself on freeing one slave who reached its shores, yet its laws supported merchants who dragged hundreds of thousands into lifelong bondage. The earliest slave plantation in North America began in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. By the late 1600s, slavery was deeply rooted in the colonies, especially in the South. Eli Whitney's 1793 cotton gin changed the cotton business, making it far more profitable and causing slave plantations to spread quickly across southern areas. In South Carolina, for instance, the slave numbers rose from about 7,000 in 1700 to more than 100,000 by 1790. This fast growth came from huge demand for cotton from northern mills and Britain. As abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison said in 1831, society would decide if the cruel slave system continued and if northern free people would share in its gains and evils. Slave plantations soon covered the American South, focusing on coastal areas of South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, plus rich lands near the Mississippi River in Louisiana and Mississippi. The 1860 U.S. Census showed almost 4 million slaves, most on around 46,200 plantations in the South. In Louisiana, slave numbers grew from roughly 4,000 in 1720 to over 331,000 by 1860, many on tough sugar plantations. The Whitney Plantation in Wallace, Louisiana, now a museum about slavery's history, stands as a strong reminder of its cruelty and size. As former slave and abolitionist Henry Bibb wrote in his 1849 life story, "Slavery is a cruel system built on blood, kept by blood, and only ended by blood." Daily life on these plantations was harsh and degrading. Slaves worked hard from dawn to dusk, with little break, often facing physical punishment. Frederick Douglass, a former slave and key abolitionist, described conditions in his 1845 book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. He told how slaves chosen for monthly supplies at the main house farm showed great excitement, filling the woods with songs that mixed deep joy and sorrow. Douglass's description of slave songs shows their mixed feelings, a blend of happiness and grief in everyday life. Another former slave, Harriet Jacobs, who fled north, explained slavery's mental pain in her 1861 book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She said slavery hurts men badly, but even worse for women, who face extra wrongs and pains unique to them. Crops on these plantations differed by area, but common ones included cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. By 1860, the South made 75% of the world's cotton, mostly picked by slaves. Tobacco, a main crop from colonial times, also depended heavily on slave work. On Louisiana sugar plantations, slaves faced especially hard conditions in hot, humid weather to grow and process the crop. In 1853, Solomon Northup, a free African-American kidnapped into slavery, described the tough work on a Louisiana sugar plantation in his book, 12 Years a Slave. Workers started in fields at first light, with only 10 or 15 minutes at noon for cold bacon and no rest until dark. When the moon was bright, they worked into the night. Northup's story highlights the non-stop slave labor and cruel treatment. The money impact of slave plantations on America was huge. By 1860, the South's slave population was worth about $3 billion, like nearly $75 billion now. Slave-grown crops made up over half of U.S. exports, and Northern and British mills relied on slave cotton. This reliance on slavery made ending it a heated issue, helping cause the Civil War in 1861. In an 1854 speech, abolitionist Wendell Phillips said the North claimed no link to slavery, but slavery affected the North. It shaped politics, hurt industry, scared leaders, harmed churches, hardened people, and lowered morals. As sunrise light spread, enslaved people in the American South already worked in fields, from Virginia tobacco to Mississippi cotton. Their days meant endless hard work, great pain, and constant danger of violence. Former slave Henry Bibb said, "I was a slave, a lifelong prisoner. I owned nothing, everything belonged to my owner." Mary Prince, a West Indian slave who became an abolitionist in England, wrote in her 1831 book that anyone saying slaves are happy in bondage and don't want freedom is either ignorant or lying. Living conditions were terrible, with families squeezed into small, run-down cabins. At Magnolia Plantation in South Carolina, digs show some cabins were just 10 by 12 feet, holding up to 10 people. Privacy was rare, and items were basic, rough beds and few cooking tools. Frederick Douglass described sleeping in his early plantation. Field children got no shoes, stockings, jackets, or pants, just 2 rough linen shirts yearly. Similar setups existed across the South, like Evergreen Plantation in Louisiana, with 4 rows of 22 cabins each, housing over 150 slaves at peak in the mid-1800s. As abolitionist and former slave Sojourner Truth said, "I bore 13 children, saw most sold away, and cried with mother's grief that only Jesus heard." Food was limited and poor, often cornmeal, pork fat, and molasses. Some slaves grew extra vegetables in small plots. Solomon Northup recalled weekly allowances, a peck of corn, 3 to 4 pounds pork or potatoes, and little salt. This led to poor health and illnesses like pellagra. Work days were long, from sunup to sundown. On cotton fields, slaves picked at least 200 pounds daily, leaving hands bloody and bodies tired. Missing quotas brought whippings or worse. Douglass described overseers whipping harder, where screams were loudest and blood flowed most. Violence hit children too, starting work young, as water carriers or watchers. Escaped slave Moses Roper wrote of seeing his mother beaten even during childbirth. Medical help was almost none. Owners saw slaves as replaceable. Diseases spread fast. Some enslaved women faced experiments like J. Marion Simms's surgeries without anesthesia in the 1840s. Life expectancy in 1850 was only 21.4 years. Infant death reached 50% on some places. Former slave Sarah Parker Remond said in 1859 that slave mothers' hearts break thinking of children possibly sold away forever. Slavery's mental effects were deep. Families split, women abused. Celia, an enslaved Missouri woman, faced repeated assaults and was executed for self-defense, killing her owner in 1855. Fear and trauma lasted generations. Former slave William Wells Brown wrote in 1847 that slavery created a wide gap between races, a dark hole both sides might fall into. This pain grew from treating people as property. In slave quarters' darkness, whispers of resistance spread. From Virginia tobacco to Louisiana sugar, enslaved people resisted quietly or boldly, risking lives for freedom. Harriet Tubman said she deserved liberty or death, one or the other. Common resistance was slowing work, pretending sick, breaking tools, or moving slowly to hurt output. Douglass recounted slaves singing wildly in woods to fight dehumanization. On sea islands, they created the shout, rhythmic singing and dancing for spirit and secret talk. Escapes were key resistance. The Underground Railroad hell had thousands reach North or Canada. Harriet Tubman, born enslaved in Maryland around 1820, led about 70 to freedom in 13 trips, earning the name Moses. William still helped over 800 escape as head of Philadelphia's anti-slavery group. In his 1872 book, he said, "Heroism and struggles should stay remembered." Bigger revolts shook the South. In 1739, Stono Rebellion had 20 Africans march in South Carolina, gaining supporters, killing at least 20 whites before stop. It led to harsher laws. In 1831, Nat Turner led about 70 in Virginia, killing around 55 whites over 2 days. It caused fear and stricter rules. Turner said chains now were nothing compared to past bondage. The 1811 German Coast Uprising in Louisiana was the biggest, with 200 to 500 slaves marching on New Orleans for a black republic. Influenced by Haiti's revolution, they burned places before brutal defeat. Over 100 killed, heads shown as warnings. One leader, Cook, said they would prove they were men, not burdens. Despite harsh punishments, resistance lived on. William Wells Brown wrote slaves lost rights, liberty, even names, treated as things, yet had human feelings. Maria Stuart said in 1833 to African daughters, "Awake, arise, show your noble abilities." In southern heat, sounds of tools echoed in cotton fields. Enslaved people worked all day under watch, powering America's growth. Frederick Douglass said in 1845, "The system saw slaves as things, not people." The 1705 Virginia Code called slaves real estate. By 1860, nearly 4 million enslaved, 13% of population, mostly in South agriculture. Slave value was $3.5 billion, like trillions today, more than railroads and factories combined. Cotton from slaves was over half U.S. exports, funding expansion and industry. Senator James Henry Hammond said in 1858, "Cotton is king." Profits went north too. New England mills depended on it. Families built wealth from slave trade. British mills got 80% cotton from south, aiding their industry. Slaves worked in iron, mines, lumber, ships, cities as dock workers, builders, servants. Profits made wealthy planters powerful in politics. John C. Calhoun said in 1837, "Slavery between races was a good." Abolitionists like Theodore Dwight Weld said cotton profits came from slave blood. Douglass called slaves the base of commerce and strength. The movement grew in 1830s to 1840s with Garrison, Stowe, Truth. It sowed division leading to war. Lincoln said in 1865, "If war continues until wealth from 250 years unpaid toil sinks and blood from lash paid by sword, God's judgments are right." As sun set, quiet voices and soft laughs came from crowded quarters. Enslaved people shared stories, songs, memories of lost homes. They built rich culture despite loss. Douglass said in 1855, slavery aimed to make slaves thoughtless for false contentment. Enslaved brought African knowledge, forming African American culture. Groups like Akan, Yoruba, Igbo, Mandinka. Many kept African religions secretly, Vodun, Santeria, Konju, with charms and herbs, gatherings in hidden spots for prayer, song, dance, music, work songs, spirituals, hollers, accompanied labor, shared feelings, coded messages. Songs like Steal Away or Wade in the Water hinted escape. In New Orleans' Congo Square, Sundays brought dances with banjo, drums. Ring shouts mixed African and European. Family networks gave support. Extended, fictive kin. Naming kept heritage, African names or surnames. Sojourner Truth chose her name for new free life. Culture resisted dehumanization. Douglass hated all of slavery's cruelty. In 1831, in a New England church, people formed the Anti-Slavery Society. William Lloyd Garrison declared in The Liberator he would speak truth harshly. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote against slave suffering. Roots in Quakers, Anthony Benezet founded First Society in 1775. Black voices like Douglass escaped 1838, shared powerful stories. Founders like Jefferson had qualms, but cotton gin made it profitable. Nat Turner's 1831 revolt galvanized movement. Sojourner Truth's 1851 speech, Ain't I a Woman? 1850 Fugitive Slave Act angered North. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Stowe turned opinion. Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 caused bleeding Kansas. Republican Party rose against spread. Lincoln's 1860 win led secession, war. Emancipation Proclamation 1863 freed slaves in rebel areas. As we look at slavery's history, remember those who suffered, from Tubman's bravery to Douglas's words, no struggle, no progress. Their strength honors us to learn and seek justice. Thank you for this journey. Until next time, stay curious, informed, and pursue justice. Goodbye.